Welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager, and I'm also joined by Dr. Ollie Douglas, the MERL's curator of collections, although he couldn't make it to record the introduction. So this year, the MERL turns 75, which is a big birthday for us. And it's the subject of our first two podcasts of the year. Last time, we kind of gave an overview of the history of the MERL. We talked about the decisions that guided our founding, why we were the way we were, and also the first collections that came into the museum. This time, we're thinking more theoretically and even philosophically about the history of the MERL and the significance of our museum within museums, within rural museums, but also within the wider history of British colonialism and empire. What is the significance of a National Museum of Agriculture within an imperial project? And what were the colonial legacies and links of our museum? We also talk about the future of the MERL, how we'd want to be remembered if we were to do this episode in another 75 years' time, which isn't off the cards, by the way, especially if people keep leaving us nice reviews and comments on social media and on your local podcast network. Enjoy the episode. Welcome back, Ollie, and our special guest, the Museum of English Rural Life.
Yeah, welcome back, museum.
Welcome back, museum. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Oh man, he sounds a lot like you, Ollie.
It does, yeah. Well, I've been sort of imposing my will on aspects of the museum for 17 years now.
It's like the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, it's begun to sound like me. Behind the curtain, there is a museum, I promise.
Yeah. So, kicking things off, how has the story of the MERL's founding correlated to theories of making museums? Like, is it a conventional approach to making a museum? And how does it link to the wider histories of heritage and museums, I guess, in England, but also thinking of Skansen and places like that?
Yeah, so I think the museum is like all museums. It has a sort of unique and interesting story of its own, and that sets it apart. There are a number of ways in which the history of the museum has been written into histories of collecting and histories of museums. I said last time that we hadn't really begun to think about the history of this museum in a critical way until relatively recently. That's often the case. So museums, once they reach a certain age, they become interested in their own foundational story. They begin to reimagine and rework that story. It's really in the context of studying the history of another museum that the story of the Museum of English Rural Life has been most carefully analysed and thought about. So a number of years ago, there was a project at the Pitt Rivers Museum, which, for those of you who don't know it, it's the University of Oxford's flagship institution for housing and looking after world archaeology and anthropology collections. It's a really significant and important museum in terms of the study of the history of museums for a whole range of reasons. I don't think there are that many people who study museum studies in this country who haven't been taught about the Pitt Rivers Museum. But we're not focusing on the Pitt Rivers and its origins. We're looking at the Museum of English Rural Life. So why and how did the story of the MERL come up in studying the history of the Pitt Rivers? Well, it's really because the Pitt Rivers, despite that outward-looking narrative, this sort of world archaeology, world anthropology focus and the perception of it as being a museum that houses material culture from other cultures, it actually has a very significant proportion of English objects. And so some years ago now, a handful of academics led by then Chair of European Archaeology, Chris Gosden, led a project about the English collections of the Pitt Rivers, and it was called The Other Within. This concept of the other within was referential to the ways in which often cultures that are beyond the bounds of the United Kingdom are often framed as cultural others. So really what this project was trying to do was turn the tables and say, well, what does it say about people historically who were building a museum collection that they chose to incorporate so much material culture from England into a project that was really about cultural othering? Mm. But in the context of studying those English collections, the Englishness Project also turned its eyes towards institutions around the UK that had also studied Englishness and aspects of English identity. Lo and behold, the Museum of English Rural Life becomes of interest. And there are a couple of academic studies that emerged from that use the Museum of English Rural Life as in some ways a counterpoint or a contrast to the Pitt Rivers or to other similar institutions.
The way you describe the eye of the other within reminded me of Sauron.
Okay, yeah. Well, in many ways, what we're talking about is a sort of colonial museum project in the case of the Pitt Rivers Museum. And I would increasingly argue that the Museum of English Rural Life represents something of the same. All museums have this absorbing, appropriating, interpreting, influencing kind of role. It's not quite the eye of Sauron, and it's not quite as sinister, but it is influencing culture out there in the world, and it's playing a part in conversations, and not always in quite as positive a sense as we would like to think.
So what were the differences that the report identified?
There were two papers that emerged from that project. Both used the Museum of English Rural Life as a point of focus. The first of those was written by Peter Riviere. Peter Riviere is long retired, but he's an anthropologist of Amazonia. Really interesting. He taught me, actually, as an undergraduate many, many moons ago. And his interest in the Museum of English Rural Life was partly that he lived in the same village that the widow of John Higgs lived. So he knew Lady Higgs quite well, and he was able to sort of go and interview her and talk to her about the early years of the museum. But he used the Museum of English Rural Life and he contrasted it with another institution, the Museum of English Life and Traditions, MERL. Hopefully all of you have heard of MERL, but none of you probably have heard of MERL. And the reason for that is that the Museum of English Life and Traditions doesn't actually exist. It never came into being. He took the idea of MERL and he contrasted it with MERL. Really what it tells us is the sort of messy way in which the Museum of English Rural Life emerged as a new player on the scene and kind of ripped the carpet out from underneath quite long-standing plans and attempts to establish some sort of museum to represent these kinds of histories. So the idea for MERL, which was the brainchild of a man called Thomas Bagshaw, a curator in Luton. He had connections to then Cambridge and County Folk Museum, which is now what's known as the Museum of Cambridge. He was also a polar explorer, so he had a, kind of entrepreneurial go-getter kind of attitude.
Very varied backstory.
Yeah. And Bagshaw had been brought into a conversation about establishing essentially an anthropology of England collection. His vision for that, for MERL, was very much that vision of an open-air folk park that we talked about last time, very much about having vernacular architecture from different parts of the country brought together in one site, within which you could celebrate different aspects of cultural practice, from sort of folk performance and song through to rural and agricultural ways of being in those landscapes and places. It was a very, very similar vision. And it was supported really by the Royal Anthropological Institute, who had been attempting to establish some sort of museum to look at specifically British tradition, British folklore, British anthropology since probably about the 1890s. So there's 40, 50 years of effort behind this conversation. And then suddenly a new player on the scene, John Higgs, Edgar Thomas, the Museum of English Rural Life, gets approval, comes out of an agriculture department, almost with no history behind it, and is successful again because John Higgs is entrepreneurial. He's a go-getter as well. He might not be going off on polar exploration, but he's certainly doing other kinds of interesting work and study. These are men who get things done. And so it comes into being. MERL ceases to be. Now, the other paper that also emerged from the Englishness project was written by Chris Wingfield. And Chris is a historian of museums, of museum ethnography. And his work focuses much more on taking the Museum of English Rural Life and seeing it as in some way in contrast to and the opposite of the Pitt Rivers Museum. So the title of his paper is From Greater Britain to Little England, the Pitt Rivers Museum, the Museum of English Rural Life, and their 6 degrees of separation. And the Greater Britain in that is essentially the sort of imperial reach of the United Kingdom. That's what the Pitt Rivers Museum represents in this narrative. And the Little England is this sort of contracting, inward-looking narrative about ruralness and Englishness that he sees as somehow representative of the breakup of empire. So the Pitt Rivers Museum is established in the 19th century, right in the heart of that colonial period when empire is at its most extensive. It's kind of a representation of that imperial power. And all of the collections amass from those kind of far-reaching connections around the world. You can see how that works. The Pitt Rivers Museum is global in that sense. The Museum of English Rural Life, meanwhile, emerging post-Second World War at a time when British protectorates and colonies are beginning to ask for independence is representative of empire that's contracting and folding in on itself, and imperial power becoming less significant. And so for Chris Wingfield, the two institutions face in different directions. It's a bit like last time we were talking about the archers looking forward and the MERL looking backwards. In this sense, the MERL looks inwards. One is
looking out and one is looking in.
Yeah. And I think what's really important is to understand that Peter Riviere's take on the history of the MERL is accurate and correct. It does come from almost nowhere and suddenly is quite successful and moves forward, and as a consequence, various other endeavours fall by the wayside. And actually, Chris Wingfield is also right. This is a moment of reckoning for empire. It's a kind of moment when neo-colonial powers are replacing colonial powers. It's a moment when Britain's influence around the world is seen to be potentially waning, and that's why we talked a little bit about the Festival of Britain last time. You know, the 1950s are a moment when the UK is conscious of its global influence, perhaps contracting a little bit and lessening. So it is trying to consolidate and do other things besides. But I think in some senses, both papers miss something. And the thing that they miss is the degree to which the Museum of English Rural Life was also a colonial exercise or a neo-colonial exercise. It also has connections through to active engagement in the wider world, both imperial and beyond.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems to me that the Chris Wingfield argument is really persuasive on a kind of immediate level, you know, when you think about what you see in the Pit Rivers, when you think about what you see here. But actually, when you go under the surface, there is much more to it. It's just a bit less obvious.
Yeah, and I think it is important to acknowledge that there was probably an explicit decision at some point not to collect agricultural stuff from other parts of the world. If you think about the moment the MERL comes into being, there are already similar collections around the wider United Kingdom. They're not in England. They're in Wales, they're in Scotland. The Highland Folk Museum comes into being in the 1930s and is fairly established by the late 1940s, early 1950s. The sort of Welsh folk collections at St Fagans, now part of the National Museums of Wales, they come into being in the late 1940s. So in what you might refer to as the kind of Celtic fringe, essentially, you're covering the bases of stories that are about nation building and national identity. England hasn't really needed that. It's never really needed to tell its own national story in that kind of way. So this isn't about building a story of really little England. It's not even really about Englishness. It's about something else. It's about a different kind of progress and change. And I think most of that centres on agricultural change or the sort of demise of heritage crafts and the reinvention as a kind of folk culture, folk revival set of practices. It's bolstering things, it's reinforcing things, but those ideas aren't necessarily bound up in ideas of the same kind of imperialism and those kind of global power relations. I guess the other thing worth saying is, yes, we don't have collections from other parts of the world, but we have collections of objects that are both influenced by technologies and traditions that have come from other parts of the world. Ploughing, you know, has its roots back in hard technologies of the Middle East. All of those kind of influences and things are there in these collections. And then we also have collections that represent a sort of trading relationship and a pushing out via empire, the imposition of agricultural technologies, 19th century agricultural engineering firms selling their wares around empire and sort of imposing those technologies in other parts of the world. So the relationships are there. It's just the stuff in the shed isn't necessarily stuff that has been taken from overseas and brought to the United Kingdom. So the relationship is slightly different.
Yeah. Just before we started recording, we were talking about the fact that our name is the Museum of English Rural Life as well, and the significance of that. But also thinking back further to some of the other founding collections. Someone we didn't talk about last time was Lavinia Smith. Ollie, would you chat about Lavinia?
Lavinia Smith was another interwar era collector. We talked a little bit last time about H.J. Massingham, a ruralist writer. Lavinia Smith was slightly different, but collecting at around the same time, so into the 1930s. She was American-born. She was from a German-American family. She studied at a liberal arts college called Wellesley College, which is famously the place where Hillary Clinton studied. So, you know, some quite famous subsequent people to go there. And she was particularly interested in the classics, but she was also a really staunch and enthusiastic Anglican. So she came across to the UK, we think probably to spend time with her sister who lived here. And then she settled here and worked for a long time for the Bishop of Gloucester as a private secretary. She taught in a school in Wantage, a girls' school where she taught the classics. So again, this sort of referential back to her classical education. And she came to settle down in a village that was then in Berkshire, East Hendred, now in Oxfordshire. So in 1974, they changed the county boundaries. So it's no longer in the county it was when Lavinia Smith lived there. Living in this village, she began to recognise the sort of hints of old trades and practices, rural life of the past, and how things were changing. So partly it's about that same sense of change over time. But she was inspired when she writes about her sort of motivations in starting to collect and build her own private museum. She writes about classics again. And the inspiration are Greek epigrams. And Greek epigrams are these sort of little turns of phrase that celebrate particular tradespeople and the technologies they use. So the sort of, oh, wondrous fisherman, see thy nets, and, see thy wonderful catch. And, these kind of turns of phrase like that. And essentially she applied the concept of the Greek epigram, this is brilliant, to collecting English rural life. So she collects a few examples of cobblers, tools and technologies to represent the trade of the cobbler, and a few things from local shepherds to represent that trade and practice, using objects essentially as hooks to hang these different rural identities on. And she fills her house, so her house in East Hendred, a house called Downside, which is still there. She fills it jam-packed full of all of these objects. And when she dies, the collections are left to the Berkshire Education Authority, so they're sort of intended to go out there and serve this educational an informative purpose. And the Berkshire Education Authority, not quite sure what to do with these things, bungs them in an old tobacco factory where they languish for a bit of time. And eventually they realise that this newfangled Museum of English Rural Life is coming into being.
It would be the perfect home for it.
Yeah, the University of Reading, they're relatively responsible. They probably think, we'll give it to them, see what they do with it.
A safer home than a tobacco factory.
Yeah. And certainly some of the larger objects that we can see in early photos of Lavinia Smith's home in situ in Downside don't actually exist. So whether they never made it out of the home and never made it to the tobacco factory, I don't know, or whether they, the tobacco factory was a bit leaky and, some of these things died a death there. We're not quite sure, but certainly really significant, alongside Massingham's collection and some of those other things we were talking about last time, really significant contribution to the sort of foundational story. And again, we talked a bit last time about how Massingham wasn't necessarily a fascist himself, but was operating in contexts around early organics where there were other fascist thinkers involved. Lavinia Smith is really interesting because we know for certain from some correspondence, nothing to do with her museum collecting work and nothing really to do with her interest in East Hendred, but we know for certain that she was quite a serious anti-Semite. So she had similar political leadings to some of these really problematic people on the peripheries of rethinking what we might do with England, what we might do with agriculture. And it's a kind of tension that runs through that kind of folk collecting of that period, a little bit like late 19th century colonial collecting carries with it a very big burden and a legacy of really problematic relations. These kind of interwar collectors were operating in a milieu, in a kind of context where politically the reasons why they're doing it, it's not quite certain, there may be sort of slightly more sinister motivations there. So we've got to be mindful of those kind of connections as well. But certainly really interesting. She was a relatively little known female collector, women collecting in that period. Obviously Massingham's also inspired by a woman, Eleanor Adlard, this sort of local collector, private collector in Winchcombe.
In the church porch.
Yeah, in the church porch. Yeah. And they're having a major influence on what essentially the MERL becomes. And Lavinia Smith is also international. She's not only bound up in these religious contexts, she's got that international component to her and influencing her as well.
So the MERL comes from much more than Little England.
very, very much so. And yeah, we talked a
with
little
all
bit,
of its complexities as well.
Yeah, we talked a little last time about those folklife influences and Skansen. That's a whole different story. I mean, that's a whole other story of sort of international influence as well.
So earlier on, this isn't in your notes, Holly. Earlier on, I mentioned the Eye of Sauron. And ever since we mentioned Little England the first time, I've been thinking about the Shire. And I feel like there is, in the same way in Lord of the Rings, you've got the Shire as this sort of very idyllic, beautiful, rural space that seems untouched by everything. There's always a sense, and as comes to pass in Lord of the Rings, that it is vulnerable and connected to this bigger, more problematic and dangerous world. And I feel like that seems at play in the approach to ruralness in the MERL as well. I mean, we had a conversation earlier before we recorded, about rural as a term. That idea of complicating what English rural life is and actually probing deeper into it seems like a huge part of the museum's mission. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think so. If we think about the fact that over the front door of the museum, it says the Museum of English Rural Life, and that was a very deliberate decision. They chose to make this the Museum of English Rural Life, not the Museum of Rural Life or the Museum of Farming Around the World or the Museum of British Rural Life. The Museum of
Farming Around the World is a much less catchy title.
Yeah,
but I mean, I take your point though.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure the Museum of English Rural Life is a very catchy title either. I mean, I don't think they thought a lot about that, to be honest. No. But we take that as our starting point. Then you've got to think back. Were they really trying to create borders and boundaries in the way that this sort of sense of Little England implies, that the idea of a sort of protected shire within which traditions thrive and survive? Were they really playing identity politics in the 1950s in that kind of way and trying to say, well, this is bounded and protected and we must conserve it and talk about it? I don't think that England felt vulnerable as a concept in the 1950s to the extent that it needed its own expression in museum form as a sort of example of nation building and bolstering.
Yeah, that anxiety wasn't there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's doing something else. But I think if we contrast that with some of the inspiring stories that lay behind it, so the folklife museum practice that John Higgs was familiar with, as we remember, Frank Stenton, the then Vice-Chancellor, had visited Skansen, that museum in Stockholm. These are institutions that were about nation building and nation bolstering. The Nordic countries, compared with the countries of the United Kingdom, are relatively new. They were coming into being in the 19th century. They needed a foundation myth, a foundation story to tell them. And what better way to materialize and make that concrete than to stick it in a museum? So the founder of Skansen, Arthur Hazelius, who's a kind of really significant figure in folklife studies, he went out and he carried out folklife archiving and recording around the Nordic nations. He collected examples of vernacular architecture, lots of material culture. So alongside Skansen, you have the Nordic Museum, which brings together some of that material. And also in Stockholm, there are really significant folk archives. A lot of that stems from this work of Hazelius and his contemporaries. And all of that is about bolstering this sense that Sweden and Norway and other nations have this right to exist. They are entities in the world that need to be recognized in some way. And I just don't think that was really the motivating factor behind the MERL. I think it was about other things. It came from an agriculture department. They probably weren't that interested in
national identity. No.
Yeah.
Or they were interested in national identity in as much as it gave parameters for a collecting policy.
Yeah. And I think that's, every museum needs a collections development policy. There's a boundedness. And John Higgs was inspired, as I said, by folklife museology. He actually had connections with people in a Danish museum called the Frilandsmuseet. Shout out to our colleagues in the Frilandsmuseet. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. My Danish is non-existent, I'm afraid. In the collections, we have a poster from the Frilandsmuseet. It's an image of a water pump, a village water pump with some ducks around it. So I rolled it out for my small contribution to Show Us Your Ducks Day.
Nice. Nice.
Do you want to talk about Show Us Your Ducks Day? Yeah.
So Show Us Your Ducks Day, or rather International Unsolicited Duck Pick Day, is probably another good example of the strange changes of the MERL's existence over time. I mean, we went from a very, very small, quite inward-looking agricultural collection to thinking much more widely about the world and the digital content we've made, whether that's a global call out to show us your duck pics on Blue Sky, or this podcast is a kind of testament to the changing journey we've been on over time, away from that very initial idea of just being a reference collection into being a museum that is much more interested in sharing experiences with people, but also a museum that's much more in conversation with the world and with other changes. And I think that feels extremely relevant when thinking about our own position as a collecting organisation in the world today.
Yeah. And I think a couple of other things about John Hicks that are interesting that extend this sense that somehow the museum was more than the sum of these sort of inward-looking, navel-gazing Little England parts in the 50s. He translated the first guidebook of the Frelensmuseet into English, so he had that kind of relationship. He wasn't just familiar with and had visited some of these places. He was actively helping and supporting the work of museums internationally. He also, as we mentioned, I think last time, had connections to sub-Saharan Africa. So he had carried out research into farm mechanization. He had an uncle who had a farm in East Africa. His uncle, Clyde Higgs, really fascinating. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Clyde Higgs, sponsored by the British government, went on a tour of Germany, studying agricultural change in sort of immediate aftermath of global conflict. And he writes up this journey around post-war Germany in a short book, which we have in the library. And in that book, he pays a fleeting reference to having seen a university museum collection of agricultural machinery at the University of Hohenheim. And Hohenheim still have a teaching collection, a reference collection of agricultural machinery in relation to their agricultural education work. Is it possible that maybe that influential sort of international example played a part in a family conversation? Was Higgs partly inspired by other examples internationally? I don't think we'll ever know, but it's possible that even that was an influence as well. But those colonial links are really important and significant, and again, are things that we weren't familiar with and didn't know enough about at the time when Peter Riviere and Chris Wingfield both wrote their papers about the origins of this as an institution. We've learned a lot more, and the story changes over time.
I didn't know that about Clyde Higgs.
Yeah, he's fascinating. He's a big British farmer. He's very well known. I think I spoke briefly last time about the two farming conferences that Oxford has now. One of those is very long running, the Oxford Farming Conference, and Clyde Higgs was at one time chair of the Oxford Farming Conference. That's a really big deal.
Yeah.
As a member of the sort of British agricultural community. He also, he worked as a broadcast journalist for the BBC, so he would have been sitting with microphones like the ones we've got in front of us, talking about farm mechanization or how to improve your dairy herd or various other things in the 1940s. And some of those conversations are written up again and can be accessed in our library in a particular book. So he's playing a part in all these big public conversations. He sits at one point on the National Parks Committee. He's a really big deal. And in the late 1940s, he, like his nephew, John, visits sub-Saharan Africa, tours around a number of different nations, settles on Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, as particularly interesting and ripe with potential for the sort of progressive farmer of Northern Europe to come and impose his ideas in a completely different landscape in another part of the world. So he buys into the lease of a large farm in the foothills of Kilimanjaro, a farm called Simba Farm, and goes about doing exactly that. He tries to sort of change the farm practice there, change the breeds of cattle that they're working with, bring in more heavy machinery. He tries growing coffee. He's experimenting and playing around with modernizing a farm in a different context.
And am I right that it goes terribly?
It doesn't go terribly. It's sort of, it's working. He buys into a farm that's actually a very well-established farm.
Right.
At a time when lots of other farms are being established, and they're largely being established so that white European settlers can come and take control of large tracts of enclosed land and bring them into what would have been seen as profitable, productive kind of farming practice. In a way, lots of this land is being framed as kind of virgin, untouched land. But of course, it sits on the boundary of two cultural groups who've been there for a very long period of time, the Chaga in the sort of forested foothills of Kilimanjaro, and then lower down into the plains below, Maasai communities. And in a way, the previous occupants of Tanganyika, the Germans, had driven a wedge between those two communities and imposed a series of farms in that space that kept the two communities slightly apart. And this was an extension of that same kind of intervention in that post-war period. And so he's doing what other people are doing at that time. He's going to other parts of the world, investing heavily in what he sees probably as the future of Greater Britain, the future of that kind of imperial late 19th century expansionist power. But in actual fact, that's waning. So he doesn't see the writing on the wall. And actually, in the early 1960s, Tanganyika gains its independence and becomes what we know of today as Tanzania. And just before it gains its independence, he's very anti-independence. Clyde Higgs leaves. He quits the farm and he comes back to England. He's actually only really a sort of occasional visitor there. You know, he's largely managing his farms in England. But there's a kind of legacy running through that, right through into contemporary agricultural education, because his niece in the 1960s, when he dies, inherits the farms that he has in England and all of the legacies of those businesses, including whatever is left of debt or profit of whatever came from Tanganyika. And when she dies, her estates go to form the Elizabeth Creek Charitable Trust. And that charitable trust funds professorships across 5 different universities in the UK, professorships in food and agriculture. So it's very much part of a kind of progressive, forward, scientific narrative and conversation about farming today that's rooted right back to those kind of colonial conversations and stories that may have been part and parcel of the same conversations that led to the establishment of the museum.
I think with Tanganyika, I was thinking of the Tanganyika groundnut scheme. And I was confusing that with...
But that's relevant too.
Yeah, because that was a disaster, wasn't it?
The Tanganyikan groundnut scheme was a total disaster.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. So, could you touch on that very quickly?
Yeah, so Clyde Higgs writes very positively about the Tanganyikan groundnut scheme when it's first mooted, as does John Higgs. So John Higgs, in his sub-Saharan research into agricultural machinery and mechanization, he visits a whole series of different countries and looks at the potential for tractorization, for bringing in of heavy machinery. And he writes about using the tractor as what he describes as a stalking horse, as a sort of sneaky way of persuading farmers who might be a little bit resistant to new technologies to develop their practice. So these are indigenous farmers, local farmers in different countries, including Tanganyika. And in Tanganyika, he visits the site of the groundnut scheme. So the groundnut scheme is British government sponsored. Essentially, it's a sort of it's a cash crop mechanism by which Europe can get hold of lots of cooking oil. There's a cooking oil shortage in Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. What better way to fill that gap than to try and cultivate vast tracts of East Africa to grow peanuts and turn them into peanut oil and export that to the UK and other parts of Europe to fill that gap? How do you go about doing that? You go across to Tanganyika, you develop a large project where you enclose vast tracts of hitherto indigenous land or native-run land. You then invest massively in machinery. You encourage lots of machinery companies to come on board. It's a bit like getting lots of machinery companies to sponsor your early museum endeavor, if museums were rooted in the idea of producing peanut oil, which of course we're not. But you get them...
Not yet.
No, not yet. Spin-off product, potentially. You get them to invest heavily, and then you sort of study the process of trying to transform this landscape. In particular, it's around a place called Kongwa, and in Kongwa they plough up vast tracts of land that haven't been ploughed up before. They try new big mechanized planting technologies to plant peanuts, and even the chief scientific advisor on the project, a man called Hugh Bunting, is quite skeptical about this from the start. He thinks they should be going softly and slowly and trying it out in smaller pockets and seeing whether it works. He thinks it's going to fail, and lo and behold, it does fail. And interestingly, it is quietly folded. It's a massive expenditure of British government money. It's quietly folded and brushed under the carpet in January 1951, the same month that the Archers comes into being, that the Museum of English Rural Life comes into being. So it's all bound up in this very particular moment. In many ways, it's happening and playing out and failing at the time when Higgs is beginning to think about the museum. Maybe he's thinking, well, actually, this neocolonial agricultural extension endeavour is going to fail. I don't think that's what he's thinking. He's quite positive about it. It's
optimistic.
It's optimistic. And I think probably he sees the museum as part of that story. So the museum is an exercise in telling a story of progressive farming and rural change in a particular landscape in a way that can be really useful and informative. If we study this history and this story and capture it and tell it, it's a blueprint.
Well, I think that's the optimism that's at the heart of the MERL's founding and work throughout much of the 20th century, I guess, is the idea that we'll collect these things that have informed farming practices and like means of production for centuries, learn about them, and then use that to inform future like policy and practice.
Yeah. And at that moment in time, if you had come to study agriculture at the University of Reading in the 1920s or the 1930s or even into the 1940s, you would probably have studied the history of agriculture as well. So the first guidebook or sort of catalogue for the agriculture collections of the Science Museum was published in about 1930. It was published by a man called J.B. Passmore. J.B. Passmore was a lecturer in machinery at Reading. He publishes a catalogue that's about the history of ploughs. So there's a culture of looking to the past to understand how you're going to inform agricultural futures. There's a culture of using that material to teach. So in this centenary year of the University of Reading, we might also look back to the year after the university gets granted its charter. So its charter is granted in 1926. 1927, the first grants of the Friends of the University are awarded. And one of those is awarded to the Agricultural Machinery Department it's awarded for the production of scale models of historic ploughs for teaching purposes, which are probably now in the collections of the Museum of English Rural Life. But you can see how in the 20s, in the 30s, studying the past is part of how you teach agriculture. It's part of an extension of what hitherto had been a sort of intergenerational transmission of knowledge from farmer to farmer's son or farmer's daughter. Now that's bound up in a sort of formal scientific transmission of knowledge in a university context. And actually, round about the 1950s, it ceases to be something that's part of the curriculum. If you study from the sort of 1950s and the 1960s forwards, it's all about progressive, forward-looking farming. It's more like listening to an episode of The Archers than a visit to the Museum of English Rural Life.
That's so interesting. So it changes dramatically.
Yeah. So there's no longer a need for the agricultural machinery hall or the sort of proto-museum collections, those teaching models. They all slowly over time get folded into what shifts away increasingly from the agriculture department. So by the time I came to work here, almost 2 decades ago, the links with the agriculture department were few and far between. We were much more closely aligned to the history department. We're a kind of arts and humanities institution, not a scientific agricultural institution. It's a sort of divide that's come about in farming. And it plays out actually in the way in which farming change is happening now. So there is a lot of discussion in nature-friendly farming contexts of essentially revisiting old ways of managing pasture, old ways of managing farmland, organics. Lots of people would describe organic farming as essentially pre-industrial farming. You're focusing on soil health, you're focusing on rotations, you're not focusing on heavy machinery, deep ploughing, you don't want to disturb the soil surface too much. All of that's essentially not that far removed from what happened prior to sort of 19th century industrial farming.
And also learning from other cultures as well, rather than just imposing this Western progressive model of agriculture on everything as if it's the only way of doing things.
Exactly.
So listening more, to global approaches.
Yeah, and listening to nature and listening to the land. And, in parallel with the Oxford Real Farming Conference, there is a spin-off conference called Listening to the Land, which is much more about spiritual connection to place and nature and rootedness in land. These don't feel like new concepts.
No,
We're revisiting ideas that perhaps we
left behind.
Yeah, we plowed them up. We deep plowed them. We groundnut schemed all over them, and we got rid of them. And now we need to revisit them.
Planted the cursed peanuts, and now we have to start over. Yeah.
And I feel really strongly about this. These collections have the potential. They don't have to play a part, but they have the potential to play a part in some of these wider conversations. So along with a couple of brilliant colleagues, I ran a session at the Oxford Real Farming Conference in January that was about how do we make sure that people know that collections and resources and archives like the Museum of English Rural Life exist? How do we try and make them accessible to farmers and growers and people who are out there trying to change farming for the better? Can they be useful? Is it too much about harking back to the past? Are we too rooted and wedded to these ideas that some of these histories are problematic? They're connected to organics as a fascist discourse or farming as a colonial discourse. Can we step beyond that and say there might be some value in these collections? There might be some future value and lessons we can learn from the past that can benefit us in the future.
So to round up these 2 episodes, which I've immensely enjoyed, so thank you, Ollie.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you for listening to me. I can drone on at you, endlessly about the history of museums.
Going right back to the start, so thinking about, the MERL was founded as this academic institution looking back at the history of farming, categorizing by material, thinking very much about technology and changing technologies. How would you like the MERL to be looked back at in another 75 years' time? What's the direction you would want the museum to go in now, and how would you want the museum to be remembered, in the future for the changes we've made and how we've responded to the past?
I think to answer that question, I'm just going to take you back briefly to the ways in which we've looked at the history of the museum in the past. So in the time that I've been here, we've celebrated the 60th, we've celebrated the 70th, and now we're celebrating, albeit in a light touch way, we're celebrating the 75th.
We're not having a major party.
No, we're not having a major party.
No biggie.
No. But for the 60th, as you'll recall, we talked about this a little bit last time. We had a joint exhibition with the BBC. We looked at the history of the museum as a sort of backwards-looking institution and the history of the Archers as a sort of forwards-looking progressive farming institution. And we told that looking backwards, looking forwards story. So we acknowledged that the museum came into being at the time of the Green Revolution, at the time of this very progressive, scientific, massive change to farming. We're obviously at the other end of that relationship now, trying to unpick some of the things that happened in the mid-20th century that have caused so much harm to environments, to soil, that we need to redress that balance and sort of address the polycrisis and the biodiversity crisis, and a lot of that is bound up in ways in which we need to change farming. So that was one way in which we talked about the history of the museum, and we need to sort of move forward with thinking about that. In 2021, when we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the museum, we chose to do that by choosing 51 items and objects from the collections that spoke in some way to that significant, critical sort of turning point moment of 1951, whether that's the first object to be collected, the animal bell, or the second object to be collected, that model threshing machine that Reading Museum kindly gave back to the university, having been given by the university in the first place, or indeed a film about the groundnut scheme. Lots of things that spoke to the significance of 1951, lots of things from the Festival of Britain. And we chose to do that by exploring different voices and different perspectives on those histories. So we invited lots of people to contribute and tell a different story about those collections. So that was about diversity of voice and beginning to maybe reach outside the box of us being that inward-looking Little England institution, but actually a little bit more than the sum of our parts. And if we're doing anything in these conversations, and if the work that we're undertaking at the museum at the moment does anything to extend those processes, then I think reflecting on colonial legacies, on international context, on how we fit into these wider frameworks of thinking about history and how history can be useful or problematic. It can be mobilized in positive ways, in negative ways. I think we're being quite critical and self-analytical. So really what I want us to take away from these conversations and over the coming months is to explore how we can better grapple with incorporating that global reach, global connectivity, inspiration for people not just from within England, but people from beyond England, relationships with those people and those communities. And it's really neat that actually that tallies very strongly with some of the work we've been doing and our wonderful colleague Philippa Heath and her team have been doing in relation to Museum of Sanctuary. We're a Museum of Sanctuary. We're part of a University of Sanctuary. We're in a city of sanctuary. These conversations about being welcoming and open to other cultures and people from different parts of the world, regardless of where they come from. And it's just about getting over that hurdle of the name. If people can get past the fact that we're the Museum of English Rural Life and get beyond the title over the door and come into the galleries, I think they will recognise that the collections that we hold, that we look after, that we hold in trust for everyone are relevant not only to the story of rural England, but relevant to lots of wider stories as well. So I think if I was to come back in, if I'm still here in 75 years' time, which seems unlikely, maybe we'll still be working here, Joe. We might not be. We might not be drawing.
Episode 14,012.
Yeah, no pensions for us.
No.
But if I was lucky enough to live that long, then I would hope that this museum has become, I guess, a meeting place and a sort of a point of contact between cultures, and we've moved beyond worrying about the problematic legacies of colonialism and the histories of enclosure, and that we've moved into a space where the collections are useful and playing a role out there in the world in terms of protecting nature, protecting food and farming and food security. They're practical and useful and playing a role again, rather than extracting from agricultural and rural communities. We're giving back.
Giving back. Yeah.
Yeah.
And creating meaning, new meaning for people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ollie. And thank you for listening. It's been a joy to be back with you in these first two episodes of 2026. And yeah, very excited for many more podcasts in the weeks and months ahead. Yeah,
no, it's going to be good. And we've got exciting stuff coming up to do with the CPRE and
the campaign to protect rural England.
Yeah. And nature connectivity and
protest.
And radical rural.
Yeah.
Radical rural.
Yeah.
It's so new that I can't even remember what we called it.
We have a very cool onion logo for a new trail in the galleries.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll be drawing in some people who are involved in those aspects of our public program to join us on the podcast and talk a little bit about, making change, direct action, being part of a shift out there in the world.
Being part of a wild chorus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful stuff.
So just before the winter break, I bumped into Nick Hayes,
what is that? Is that
little jingle bells? Did you hear that?
I can hear it in the mic. Is there a ghost? I don't think it's your drink. I think it's something outside. It might be like migrating birds or something.
Well, that's very exciting. Nature part of the podcast.
Healing.
Yeah. So just before the winter break, I bumped into Nick Hayes, the writer and illustrator and Right to Roam campaigner. And I mentioned that I was hoping to put some of the books that he's written, or maybe some things featuring artwork that he produced, into our forthcoming gallery trail. And he said, "Oh, does that mean we're old news now? Does that mean our work is dead? It deserves to be in the museum?" Hopefully, if we make any kind of change as a result of the conversations that you and I have been having today and the work that represents, we'll reach a position where being part of the story in a museum doesn't mean that you're out there in the world.
That it's past.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that you're not out there in the world making a difference. It means that...
It's just that I think it's that kind of inspiration and magic happens somewhere else. It's not the magic of seeing an object or being an object in a case. It's the connections that people are forming between them.
So I want us to reshape museums to be not just about looking backwards and not just about looking inwards, but to be about looking outwards, as you said earlier.
And dreaming.
And about looking forwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, dreaming. Dream space.
There we go.
We talked about that in an episode, didn't we?
We might have talked about it when we talked about clowning as well.
Yeah.
Comes full circle.
Yeah. We haven't talked enough about clowning. I feel like we need to talk more about clowning.
We can do another episode about clowning.
Yeah.
Clowning
and the Museum of English
Clowning
Rural
at the
Life.
Museum of English Rural Life,
And dressing up again.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Absolute Units. I'm Joe Vaughan.
And I'm Ollie Douglas.
Absolutely. Sorry, we can't keep a straight face because we've just had 2 minutes of unhinged cuts that we can't put on the podcast.
I'm convinced I am Ollie Douglas. Though,
you are Ollie Douglas.
Not Joe Vaughan.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Absolute Units is made possible by Museums Partnership Reading, an Arts Council funded partnership of the MERL with Reading Museum. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time talking about something else.
Yeah.
We've got lots of cool things coming up, but I'm not sure what will be out in what order.
Yeah. Well,
which is exciting. Live in mystery.
Yeah, live in the dream.
Live in the dream.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, imagine like the pioneering people behind the Museum of English Rural Life.
Who knew what they were getting into.
Cowbell. Into the accession register. Just like, what will come of this?
It doesn't actually get more exciting than that, does it?
Yeah. Just a blank page in a ledger.
A blank page ready to be written.
Yeah.
With the words cowbell.
Yeah.
My name is Cowbell.
Yeah. What will I be?
Well, there we go. See you next time.
See you next time.